everyone. My name is Rachel Moran. I am a professor here at the University of California, Irvine School of Law, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this, the final one of our book talks in our Reimagining the Latinx Experience series. Before we get started, I wanted to just make a few acknowledgements. First of all, I want to thank Dean Austin Parrish at the University of Irvine School of Law and Interim Director Bryant Garth at the American Bar Foundation for ongoing support for the Future of Latinos project, which includes this book talk series. I also wanted to thank my research assistant, Elizabeth Schatz-Cordero, who really helped me to put this whole series together, and Robbie Kadri, who makes it possible for it to run smoothly. Now, we're very fortunate for this final session to be featuring a book called A Place at the Nayarit, How a Mexican Restaurant Nourished a Community by Natalia Molina. And this book also, we have a discount available through the publisher. They generously offer that for 30%, which was part of your registration confirmation, but we'll also be putting that information in the chat function. Now, when we do the presentation, Professor Molina will be talking about the book, and then we'll be receiving commentary from Professors Jennifer Chacón and Kevin Johnson. We also want to hear your questions, which you can put in the Q&A function, and my assistant, Elizabeth, will make sure to monitor that and pose your questions. So we do want to hear from you. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to briefly introduce all of our speakers today. Very impressive. So I'm going to have to only give you the highlights. But Professor Molina is Distinguished Professor in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. And she is also currently serving as Interim Director of Research at the Huntington. She works at the intersection, at the interconnected histories of race, place, gender, culture, and citizenship. And she has written other award-winning books, including How Race is Made in America, Immigration, Citizenship, and the Historical Power of Racial Scripts, as well as Fit to be Citizens, Public Health and Race in Los Angeles, 1879 to 1940. So this is her most recent book, and we're really looking forward to hearing more about it. She is also a 2020 MacArthur Fellow, and in addition to her scholarly work, she has served in various important capacities, including as Associate Vice Chancellor for Faculty Diversity and Equity and Associate Dean for Arts and Humanities. She received her bachelor's in Gender Studies and History from UCLA and her master's and PhD in History from the University of Michigan. Professor Jennifer Chacón is the Bruce Tyson Mitchell Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. Her work is at the nexus of immigration law, constitutional law, and criminal law and procedure. She is a co-author, along with Dean Johnson, I believe, of the textbook Immigration Law and Social Justice, which is now in its second edition. And she's co-authoring a forthcoming book in this year, I take it later this year, exploring the past decade shifting immigration policies and how they've shaped and been shaped by immigrant communities and organizations in Southern California. She's written dozens of articles, book chapters, and essays on immigration, criminal law, constitutional law, and citizenship issues. And she's an award-winning teacher and holds a JD from Yale Law School and her bachelor's in international relations from Stanford. Last but certainly not least, we will be hearing from Kevin Johnson, who is the Dean and Mabie-Apallas Professor of Public Interest Law and a Professor of Chicano Studies at the University of California, Davis. He, in addition to being Dean, it always amazes me, Kevin, how much writing you get done as a Dean, because it's such an onerous responsibility. But he's taught a wide array of classes, including immigration law, civil procedure, complex litigation, Latinos and Latinas in the law, and critical race theory. And in 1993, received the law school's Distinguished Teaching Award. And he's a prolific scholar. He's published extensively on immigration law and civil rights, published in 1999, he wrote the book with the provocative title, How Did You Get to Be Mexican? A White Brown Man's Search for Identity, which was nominated for the 2000 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. He has also written Immigration Law and the US-Mexico Border in 2011. And he is, as I mentioned, a co-author of the Casebook on Immigration Law and Social Justice and blogs at Immigration Prof. He received his bachelor's degree in economics from Berkeley and is a graduate of Harvard Law School. So I know we're in for a treat, and I want to turn it over now to Professor Molina.
I was already taking notes on things that I wanted to follow up on in people's bibliography. It's such a pleasure to be here, partly for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that I went to law school. I went to University of Michigan in the 90s, and there were so few Latinos at that time, and so we would find each other. The University of Michigan had a great affirmative action program, and that's how I got the funding to go. There's no way I would have gone to, a place I'd never been and committed to a PhD without that. So I'm very grateful to them. But because would seek each other out, I ended up becoming friends with a lot of people in the law school who I'm still friends with today. And the law school was one of the places that nurtured me, because they did a lot to bring in professors and speakers on critical race studies and Lat Crit. And so it was one of the first places that I saw the intersection of race, class, gender, sexuality, and the law. And one of my main, my main shtick, my main thing for my work has been really thinking about what creates race, how we think about race, and how that changes over time, especially in terms of race and citizenship. And I think about the stories we tell about race and the structures that we create to inform race, and law has been pivotal to it. So I'll give you a very brief background around that. Let's see. Oh, but first I need to share the screen. Share. View slideshow. Okay, I think we're fine, and if not, someone will tell me, right? So this is my recent book that I'll talk about today, and that we'll have a conversation about a place at the Nayarit, how a Mexican restaurant nourished a community. But before that, I wrote these books on public health and basically immigration law, to think about how we create these containers of race. And these were books where I was able to use law, use city council records, congressional hearings, petitions, court cases, zoning laws, all kinds of things around the law that you all are more familiar with, many law school journals, legal theory, in order to tell these stories of how we talk about race. And then, to the extent that I could, see how everyday citizens, see how immigrants push back on those by looking at petitions when people wrote into the court, by looking at when people appeared before the city council, when Mexican immigrants wrote to the Mexican consul. But I really, also wanted to, I really wanted to tell the story starting from those perspectives, but in telling these stories of public health, of immigration, historically, they were difficult to get to. And just because you all are my people, if you're here, you're interested in Latino studies, in race and immigration, just to give you a sense of how difficult this journey has been, and I don't just mean for myself, but anybody in this field. This is a story that the LA Times did, and I was included in it, from 2000, right? A new place in history. Wow, Latinos, we're here. And they recently did this other story, Latinos in the Vanguard, LA Vanguardia, and I got to be covered and included in this too. I'm like, I'm tired of being at the vanguard. I would like our stories to be old news. I would like everybody to know about this, right? In LA, we're 50% of the population. In the United States, 20%. When are immigrants and immigrant stories, and also that fact that immigrants have children and some of us are third, fourth generation? When do we get to be the old news? So just giving you a sense of kind of where these stories have been fitting in. Today I'll talk about my new book, A Place at the Nayarit. And, oops, sorry. Just trying to, what I did then for this book was, because I was tired of these stories being new, I wrote it in a way that I hope people can use it in their classrooms or just be inspired by it to tell their own stories. So I really tried to go heavy with the concepts and for people to see this as one example of how we do this. So I write the story of the Nayarit restaurant in Echo Park on Sunset Boulevard that my grandmother, Natalia Molina, who I refer to in the book and in this presentation as Doña Natalia, because everybody called her Doña. She was not a warm, fuzzy person. This is not about my grandma. This is about a woman who was an immigrant who came here on her own, you know, just a major chingona who did not care what people thought of her and started her own restaurant, adopted 2 children on her own, and then worked to bring in 100 other immigrants. By writing letters of, of support for them, by hiring attorneys. I don't know how she got the idea to hire attorneys, but she hired attorneys to help her with these visas. One of the first attorneys she hired was Carlos Terán, who went on to serve on the California State Supreme Court. And so she would always find what she didn't know and then work to have those people help her. And so she became what I call a placemaker in the book, and in terms of establishing this restaurant. And then she helped create space for immigrants to become placemakers by being workers at the restaurant, by finding, carving their space in Los Angeles. By then, many of those workers went on to establish their own restaurants. So if you're familiar with LA and you've ever been to Barragán, if you ever got a margarita at El Conquistador or El Chavo, or La Via Tosco, kind of this whole lineage of Mexican restaurants in Los Angeles, in Echo Park and Silver Lake. They first started in Echo Park as placemakers. I also wanted people to see that Mexican restaurants could be urban anchors. We're so used to thinking of official institutions as our urban anchors, like schools and hospitals and libraries. But as you know, the way that segregation works, these public spaces, when we think about parks, we think about urban anchors as needing to be public because they're democratic spaces. But for people of color, that hasn't always been the case. We know that public parks, schools, beaches, on and on, so many public spaces have been segregated. And so immigrants needed to carve their own urban anchors, their own place where they could feel at home, where they could claim space, where they could speak in Spanish, where they could belong. This was especially important in places like Los Angeles. There's a new book by Danielle Olden, who I think has been part of your work in different ways, looking at really trying to reclaim, just because it's the West and California doesn't make it this incredibly liberal progressive space where we haven't had immigration, right? So all the ways in which places like Los Angeles have been redlined. And so that is what makes Echo Park, where the story takes place, even more special, because my grandmother started a restaurant in Echo Park, which was not an ethnic enclave. It was a geographic crossroads where lots of people came through, and that also made it a cultural crossroads. So it's really important as a single woman, as someone who employed gays and lesbians, for her to be somewhere where people could be that weren't living traditional lives, to feel a little bit more as if they could claim space and belong. And this is also a story by having people tell their story. The stories we don't find in the archives is really important. I wrote those first 2 books, and the first one especially hoping that I could tell the story of women, of parteras, of midwives, of curanderas, of sobadoras, all the women who did healing in the communities. I thought that would be one place where I could tell the stories of women in the early 20th century, because I figured those were services that were needed, but those records didn't exist. And then for my second book on immigration, how immigration law shapes our notions of citizenship from 1924 to 1965. Again, many of those people weren't around to do oral interviews, so it was really told kind of top down. So this is a way of telling that story, but also of laborers who, Latinos are both hyper visible, as we see when something goes wrong, and then invisible in terms of, who gets the credit for things. My new book that I'm working on is the Huntington Library and the Mexican workers that built it, right? So we tell the story of the Huntington and Henry Huntington and that great man, but not all the workers that built that space. And this is also a story of, telling our histories without the archives to support it. My past books have told stories that the archives didn't want to tell, didn't mean to tell. This is the National Archives. For my last book, it's the microfilm reel, Finding Aid Alone was 32 reels. And so just trying to find these little shards within this was very difficult. But for this book, I did all my tricks, and Kevin knows I've called him when I'm trying to figure out a story and it wasn't there. So it really started with oral histories and then trying to contextualize those. And then one day it hit me, there's a Spanish newspaper that my great aunt, my tia Chayo, because I never met my grandmother, she passed before I was born, called El Eco de Nayarit. This is an example of their anniversary issue, and I included in the book. And the Echo actually told these stories of people in Los Angeles because they would write into it. And so this is an ad that she placed. So, again, how we tell these stories, the archives doesn't always help us. The legal record doesn't always help us. But if we can read those stories against the grain, if we could think about being creative in our sources, such as Spanish language sources, such as sources even outside of the country, in this case of a newspaper, these are the kinds of things that will facilitate us telling our stories. So thank you so much for joining me today. And I look so forward to these comments and questions.
Thank you so much for this beautiful book. I guess I'll kick off, and then I know Kevin has things to say as well. I do want to thank you for the book and for the stories and for being on the vanguard, even if the vanguard never seems to yield to any sort of more permanent state. And I'm hoping that it will. If it does, it's because of people like you who have been doing this work and telling these stories. And I really, really appreciate the work. So I love this book. It's a story of a restaurant, but also a story of a neighborhood, a diasporic community, a city, and really a nation too, thinking about how race is made in America. This sort of tells another version of that story. Dr. Molina has already told us what the book is about, and I think we'll learn more from asking for questions than from hearing me talk. But I did want to say a few words as a reader about themes that really jumped out to me and spoke to me as I was reading. So the first was something that you alluded to in your remarks, Dr. Molina, and that's the notion of the importance of semi-private, semi-public spaces, right, in the building of community for immigrant residents. So as you said, we often think and talk about public spaces like parks or libraries or municipal buildings or schools as the most significant spaces of public life. And there's a lot of hand-wringing in the US, I think appropriately so, because some of our public spaces are pretty impoverished when compared to other countries. But your book, I think, really makes clear the way that public spaces have been for a long time in the US under-inclusive and discriminatory spaces, and so really require creative approaches to placemaking. So Black people, racialized immigrants, Native American communities have been systematically and often legally excluded from public spaces. So these spaces are the spaces for what in the book you offer as spaces of, quote, safety and community. So restaurants, barbershops, dance studios, these are the spaces where marginalized communities come and still come together. They came together historically, they still do, in ways that are more free of assimilative pressure. And allow themselves to be and to generate the kinds of community that in which they are comfortable and in which they can bring their whole selves. The second theme that really caught my imagination as I was reading was the food. And I don't just mean the description of the dishes, although I did get really hungry reading chapter 2. But I'm thinking more specifically of what Dr. Molina describes at page 126 as food as a political act. So you write in the book, Dr. Molina, about the ways that controlling food is a way of subjugating people. So you talk about the city of Los Angeles's condemnation of Mexican food as disease-bearing and unhealthful in the 1920s. And as I was reading these stories, I was reminded of my father's story of growing up in West Texas in the 1940s and the 1950s and packing a lunch that was white bread with a slab of lunch meat in it. And the reason he had that sad lunch was because my grandmother recognized that going to school with his home cooked meals was going to be a source of discrimination. It was going to be his Mexican food would be ridiculed. This was at a time when you were punished for speaking Spanish on the playground. And so although she cooked healthful and delicious Mexican food at home, what he went to lunch with was far less healthful and less delicious, but sort of assimilated food. And I was really struck by the story of the way that the Nayarit really tried to resist those assimilative pressures, and that was itself a political act. And the way that contrasts with some of the other stories you weave in the book, the stories of the restaurants like El Coyote and El Cholo, where people unapologetically cater to the taste of folks that my Texan father would have called Anglo, right? Anglifying the food. And so I feel like these are really important reflections on the difficulties inherent in the concept of authenticity, but also giving us clarity about the exploitative edge of the cultural appropriation of food. So as in music, we see sometimes those who remain rooted in community don't succeed as long as those who cater to broader, wealthier, and wider audiences. But this book reminds us that the way that food is prepared and sold and regulated can tell us a lot about which communities are dominant, how that dominance manifests, and also how culture, tradition, and joy through food has been and remains possible and vital as ways of forming community and belonging. And then the third thing that really struck me in reading was this book's elaboration of notions of fictive kinship. So Dr. Molina, you described the ways that Doña Natalia's restaurant served as a space where extended family members and non-blood relations formed ties of mutual responsibility and mutual obligation. Even in the ways that Maria and her brother come to be adopted by Doña Natalia, right? And then you have the stories of her assistance to her distant, quote unquote, nephew, Pedro, as he sought to build his career in the United States. And these stories show how Doña Natalia and others like her were able to build their own kinship networks that were less constrained by gender and sexuality norms than is often the case in kinship relationships. It's worth stressing, I think, that you are clear that Doña Natalia was aware of gender and sexuality norms, and in many ways didn't try to deviate publicly and openly from these norms. So she was also adherent to them in some ways, but she was divorced, she was single. The Nayarit functioned as a safe space for many gay Latina men at a time when both racism and homophobia was threatening their lives. She provided them with economic opportunities. She provided them with economic opportunities for women when they were shut out of many parts of the formal economy. So she was able to sort of leverage the capitalist structure of the US immigration system by sponsoring people to come to work for her. So she's using employment-based immigration opportunities to build family. Which I found a really fascinating sort of reversal of the way we think about sort of family-based immigration and employment-based immigration. Here she is making kin through employment-based immigration opportunities. And I thought that was really striking and rich. So there's a line on page 165 where you write that Doña Natalia thought that helping others is just what you did, and she did it well. And I wanted to just close by saying I was really moved by that, and it resonated with me because throughout my life, I've observed how it's the most vulnerable people, the poor, the new arrival, the racial outsider, the divorcee, the single woman, the person who's gender nonconforming, the people with the most to lose, who often best understand the urgency of human connection and who pour their energy into making the world a nicer, a better, a more manageable place for the people in their orbit. And it really sounds like she did that through this restaurant. And so I was very touched and moved by that. And I just want to thank you for the book.
I want to start my remarks by thanking Professor Moran for inviting me and thanking Professor Dr. Molina for writing the book, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Now, the Future of Latinos project focuses on drivers of Latino mobility, immigration, education, economic participation, and political participation, civic engagement. And it strikes me that a place at the Nayarit strikes all of those in important ways. And it may be a sign of the times, but I have a confession to make, and I hopefully I don't embarrass myself by making a confession. I first learned about the book when I was listening to a podcast, the Hidden History of L.A. podcast, that came out in I think it was late April 2022. And it featured an interview with Dr. Molina about the book. And I learned from the interview why I have followed her work so closely over her career. She understands Latino L.A. I'm from L.A. And it just struck me that there's so much that she sees that resonates with me. And then I was happy, incredibly happy. Some people can't imagine how happy I was to learn that she's an ardent Los Angeles Dodgers fan and loves to be in Dodger Stadium, despite the fact that many Latinos were forcibly removed from that community. And that I also was happy to learn that she's enjoys and she's not judgmental about whether you say Philippe's or Felipe's as a place to get roast beef. So I learned a lot from the podcast, and I became aware of the book, and I thought just when I read it, how important tying together all that she tied into, the immigration, the food, the culture, the economics, the stories. And there's so much history and stories to be told. Even if Dr. Molina doesn't want to be said to be at the vanguard, sadly, there's so much to be written. We're still at the vanguard stage of so many things. And it's so meaningful to people when they see books and articles and other things about their history. I remember a few years ago when Gilda Ochoa's book came out, Becoming Neighbors in a Mexican American Community. It's about the city of La Puente in the San Gabriel Valley. And when I told my wife, who's from La Puente, Virginia, about the book, she was shocked that anybody had written anything about La Puente. And then, in fact, it was a Latina who left La Puente because she didn't know any Latinas except her and a couple other people who'd ever left that town. And it was meaningful to her and to her entire family to learn about this book and this history being out there, and led to a robust discussion about the tensions, conflicts, similarities between Mexicans and Mexican-American immigrants in that community. I love the story about the Nayarit, about the family, the history, your grandmother who sounds like quite a character. But it also, as Professor Chacón mentioned, tells a community story and an immigrant story. And I think that there are a lot more stories to be told. Throughout Southern California in particular, there are these networks of Mexican restaurants, these networks of places where social connections were made, and some of them are bars as well, when other places weren't available to make social connections, community institutions, for example. And it resonated with me, the statement or the observation that the Nayarit showed a community creating their own belonging among themselves and allowing for them to feel accepted and having impact on their own community, as opposed to being forced to try to insert or assimilate themselves into somebody else's community. So I found this microhistory fascinating. And one of the things about Los Angeles that I think makes Dr. Molina's work so incredibly important is that for generations in LA, Mexicans wanted to be anything but Mexican, to paraphrase Rui Acuña's book. The claim was you should be, we're Spanish, we're not even Mexican. We don't even recognize that people in our family came from Mexico. And I think there is an incredible amount that can be written and should be written. And even though I wish Dr. Molina wasn't at the vanguard and there were 100 other people writing in these areas, I think there's an awful lot to be written. And some of the things have been identified, but not written on in any human detail. The stories I don't think have been told that have gotten out there about the mass removal of Latinos during the repatriation. I was at a history conference in downtown LA last week, and people didn't realize that the repatriation, a large part of it took place within blocks of where the conference was being held. I think that while some people know, there's a lot of people in LA who don't know about the history of Dodger Stadium and Chavez Ravine and what happened to the people who used to live there. And I'm looking forward, maybe I'll get myself in trouble here, but I'm looking forward to when there's more work done about the greater meaning to LA's Mexican American community of the emergence of Fernando Valenzuela as a Dodger in the 1980s, because the place went crazy because it was basically the first Mexican American to make be made a star in LA, and it was a great sign of inclusion that had a huge impact on the community, even for people who didn't have much use for baseball. Now there's a lot more I could say, but those are things that people know about, or some people know about, that can be written on it. There's an awful lot that can be written about the basic issues of gentrification and the impacts on Latino communities. Monterey Park's been in the news a lot lately. Monterey Park now has a huge Asian American community. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was largely Latino and white working class people. It's been transformed as Latinos have moved further east, I shouldn't say west, further east over time. I'm not saying that there's a problem with what happened in Monterey Park, but changes have occurred and populations have moved. And these histories, if they're not written now, they're never going to be written. And I worry about the passage of time. But there's so much I could say, but I want to thank you, Dr. Molina, because you got me putting my thinking cap on, which a lot of people around me say I should wear more often. Thanks.
And now, Professor Molina, if you'd like to respond, and then we'll have some questions from Professor Chacón and Dean Johnson. But we do want to hear your questions, so please use the Q&A function to share your questions with us.
Oh, I'm just so grateful for the comments. You write a book and you always want to know, like, what are the concepts that people picked up? And so, I'll start somewhere else, which is I'm writing this new book called The Myth of Assimilation. And it's a popular press book. It's a short book. It's meant for a popular audience. And I'm at a really difficult point in it because I've never written a book that's a popular press book. I write a ton of op-eds. I love it. I wrote one on the Dodgers called Loving the Dodgers is Complicated If You're Latinx, to get at those contradictions. I'm a historical consultant for Perry Mason, and I just wrote an op-ed on that because exactly what you said, Kevin, people don't know that about repatriation. They don't know about Chavez Ravine, and this is not a documentary, but it gives us a chance to tell that story in a different way. And so I really see it as an invitation to the past. And I'm always like, how can we get our stories out there through every medium we can? So I was happy to do it, even though it wasn't, a documentary. But telling our stories in that popular press kind of way, it feels so vulnerable. I think we're so used to telling our stories through research. I think even if we do, when we teach on immigration and we research and write, it doesn't necessarily feel personal, even though it is so personal to us, right? And so this book is kind of a weaving a braid almost of telling the personal with the historical, because I want people to be able to unpack those personal moments and see, no, the reason that happened is shaped by history. It's shaped by law. It's shaped by these strong cultural forces. And if you write it as a journal article, only a certain amount of people are going to read that. So it's very inspiring to, think about Kevin's book that received the RFK award for Jennifer telling me about, thinking about those people who most have, that have the most to lose. Reminded of Gilda Ochoa's work on La Puente, which is so important. Gilda was my, we were on what did we work in? One of those summer research programs at UCLA for first-gen students. Because we don't see those spaces always told, those stories, and not just the people, but the spaces, right? That's what makes it so important. To your point, Kevin, there's a judge, Carlos Moreno, who served on the California Supreme Court, right? Carlos Moreno grew up in Chavez Ravine. He's this judge that, served on, California Supreme Court and been an ambassador. And yet he goes around telling his story of Chavez Ravine. He does seminars on it because he understands that people need to be seen in the law. People need to be seen in the historical record. So I have to say that, thank you for your response, but your responses have also inspired me as we keep going. And I'll say one thing about Kevin, because I've known him a long time, and this speaks to your point about how does he get so much done? I always have to remember you're a dean, because every time I see you, you want to engage with ideas. You have such a curious mind, and you've told me along the way, it's like when I've given talks and you come up to me afterwards, like, you haven't written that down. You need to write that down. And so I just want to thank you. And I was very greedy to, when they asked for me to join this, I was like, I would like interlocutors, because I know my story. I want to hear what other people say. So I'm very grateful to have reconnected with Kevin Johnson. And I'm very grateful that I now feel a connection with Jennifer Chacón, and just thank you.
Thanks so much. So I have a question for you, if we can spend a little time in Q&A before we open it up. But my question was about capitalism. So moving from the personal and warm to sort of the structural, you're telling a story of Echo Park as a place that at least some people are calling bohemian at the time, although you notice that who calls it bohemian is a mixed question. It's filled with artists, it's filled with outsiders, it's characterized by a left politics, including socialist and communist European emigres. But you could characterize Doña Natalia as the quintessential capitalist, right? She runs a restaurant, she's a homeowner, she's a landlord. One way to tell her story would be to focus on this as a kind of capitalist success, present her as an archetype of an immigrant who opens a small business and finds economic security and belonging. And thank goodness that's not the story you told. You focused really on the social networks that extend and grow out of and around the restaurant, and on the ways that people build these networks and create place. And you, at one point, were actually right, running a business was not a transaction for Doña Natalia. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you thought about the relationship of capitalism and placemaking, particularly in the context of this story.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. And I did think about that as one of the frameworks. One, I did want to tell the story of Latino immigrants that, for all intents and purposes, might have even been considered middle class. We don't often tell that story. I think when we're talking about class, when it comes to communities of color, that might look differently. Had the great honor and privilege of being taught by Elsa Barkley Brown. And anytime we talk about class, she'd say, take that out, describe it. And we know within African-American literature that class looks very different in terms of when you think about people who worked on trains, as sleeping in the sleeping car porters, that worked as, I'm forgetting the name for it, the people that greet you at a hotel, right? All these ways in which Blacks were able to enter the middle class through these kind of jobs that you don't think about as middle class jobs. And so I was really interested in that. She wanted people to work for her and then build their skills. So she also did kind of job training programs by sending them to bartending schools. She also wanted them, if they were young enough when they came, to learn English. And that she really focused on the cultural capital as well, which I always thought was very interesting. And I think one of the disadvantages we have in ethnic studies, we've gotten so much out of ethnic studies in terms of that it grew out of social movements, and we have these robust bodies of literature, Asian American, African American, Latino studies, indigenous studies, but we don't always speak to one another. And capitalism would be one of those places where we could. So within African American literature, because that tradition has gone on a little bit longer, and as I said, in terms of complicating how we think about class, we also know that they talk about Black capitalism. And Marcia Chatelain, Pulitzer Prize winning book Franchise, talks about this. And so for a while, I was playing with like brown capitalism, but it also kind of took over the story in a way when I really wanted to also talk about the networks, the fictive kin, the social capitalism, the fact that the cultural capitalism, the fact that, if she was just running a business, she wouldn't have worked so hard training these people who've never worked in a restaurant. So, but it is something in there, and I hope that people build on that.
Thank you.
I have a very straightforward question, but I'm curious about it. How do we encourage scholarship like yours? I mean, it's so rich and, so on the vanguard. We need more of it, but it doesn't seem like we're getting more of it.
I do a lot of administrative work. I've been doing administration for about 15 years. I think it's really important, the work that you all are doing in administration, because we're creating those pipelines to help bring people into the academy and make them successful. But part of the reason that makes it hard for me to leave it completely is, go full time, is because I love the graduate training, as I'm sure you do as well. And writing books in a way, I hope, that become more accessible. I think there's that tension when you're writing a book, right? It has to sound smart, it has to sound a certain way, but try to make it accessible so that people use it. And I've always tried to keep my family in mind as I wrote, and I always think of, I'm writing for a smart, engaged undergraduate. But especially in this book, I really tried with the concepts of placemaker and urban anchor, and I'm developing high school curriculum for it. I think now with technology, with GSI mapping, with digital storytelling, with story maps, with the way that people can use Instagram and TikTok and Twitter and all this to tell their stories, I think now more than ever, we can start engaging students to tell those stories in that way. And part of it is just, again, over and over telling them that their stories are worthy of being told, giving them examples. I just went and looked at the Judy Baca murals that are up at the Geffen in Mocha in downtown LA. I mean, that book was pivotal to me when I was an undergraduate, when I was a graduate student. It was the first example of like, oh, our stories can be out there, and constantly, getting that message home, creating the structures for people to thrive in the academy to do that, and then giving them the tools to do so. It's such a multi-pronged approach. And then of course, all the work that we do in terms of mentoring students, but as well as one another and professors. And somebody recently asked me to be their mentor. And I said, I'm really trying to get away from that model. We have a group at USC, we started during the pandemic online. We did these retreats, every student I worked with and myself, and there were about 15 of us. And we started by sharing out what's working for us, what's not working for us, what do we need as we transition to being on this online community during the pandemic. And it really taught me in real time what we talk about is that 360-degree mentoring. And, that's why I also mentioned, of course, I know you're a dean, but that's not how you engage with people. You engage with people of wanting to be in conversation. And the more we can continue to do that with people, our students, the people that we meet along the way, the most vulnerable people, as Jennifer said, the more that people will see themselves as having dignity, having a story to tell, and wanting to share that and trusting us with those stories.
I wondered if I could ask, and I know we probably want to leave some time for the audience, so this will be my last question, but I was interested in the writing so close to home. And you did it with this book. Dean Johnson did it with How Did You Get to Be Mexican? So it's something that both of you have done that I haven't done, and that that makes me a little nervous. So you have to take a microscope to people who are actually very close to you as you're telling a bigger story. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, the how it feels to write a book like that. Are there topics that you felt like were off limits or uncomfortable to approach? Did you find yourself softening some sharp edges? Did you learn new things about yourself or your family in this process? And I just wanted to hear a little bit about what it means to bring so much personal into what is very much an intellectual project in the social history, but that does involve people who are very close to you.
We could have done a whole hour on this one. So I will try to keep it brief. I also do a newsletter. You can sign up at my website, nataliamolinaphd.com, and it's at the bottom. Because I have been grappling with this, Jennifer. As one, I started it because people have shared all these amazing stories with me throughout as I give talks. And I've been wanting to put that in there. But as people ask me questions like this, I'll do a newsletter on it, or I'll interview an expert like Virginia Espino, the brilliant scholar who did the documentary No Más Bebés. I mean, I'll just say it was a process, right? So I certainly didn't start to tell this story in that way. And I certainly used the scholarship to kind of serve as a bit of a buffer. So, one of the main reasons I wrote this book is because I hadn't seen a story like this in urban studies. And I thought it was important. One of the reasons I didn't write this book is because my mother, who is like, I never met my grandmother. My mother is one of the most unreliable narrators there is. She's the heroine of her own story, and she will always start with this like amazing thing, like we were on the dance floor and your aunt came this way and had her hair done here and I had mine here and we met in the middle. I'm like, Mom, I just asked you that, you were married to my father who's passed and was there when RFK was assassinated, these kinds of things. So, part of it was just, using my historian's hat. I talked to Vicky Ruiz, what it was like to do oral interviews. I talked to Virginia Espino. I read all the books on it. I consulted all the literature. And then I did what we do, right? We fact check, we confirm things with archival evidence. What I did need to learn is something that we're not often taught in graduate school, which is to talk about the silences I found and, talk about when stories contradicted. There's a sense that like oral history should be this truth source. And of course they're not, just like every other source has silences. But what I wasn't used to was talking about it. So, finding that census record where my grandmother and my grandfather were living together in 1930, when every family story said that she only married him to adopt my mother and uncle. And this contradicted it. And because she was the first immigrant in the family to come, there was no one there to tell me anything different. So rather than try to paper over it, I was very clear about it. Gustavo Arellano, the LA Times journalist, he interviewed me for this book for an article on Alta, because Alta had picked it as a book club. And to your point about Felipe's, Kevin, I had him meet us there and gentrification, because so many restaurants in Echo Park had closed. So I said, let's just go to Felipe's. It's kind of a Latino restaurant because everybody that works there is Latino anyway, right? People have worked there for like 40 years. And my mom, again, the heroine of her own story, and she loves Gustavo. She reads him in the LA Times all the time. She leans in and she says, Gustavo, I'm going to tell you a story I've never told anyone. And so then she tells this great story, and it has like discrimination, it has cultural representation, it has everything. And I'm just like, Mom, that would have been great for the book. So, part of it is seeing this as a process. And that's why I love the newsletter, that I keep writing about it. And hopefully one day those stories will turn into something.
Well, thank you so much for writing it.
We should have audience questions now.
Again, if you want to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A function. And we really welcome hearing from you about what stories have mattered to you, what role you think they've played. So, please don't hesitate. In the meantime, Kevin, feel free to ask another question.
Dr. Molina, a couple of your books focus on Los Angeles, as I talked about in my comments. Is it easier or harder for you to write about something you're so passionate and immersed in? I find I like to write about Los Angeles because I find it so energizing, and I feel strongly about it. For me, it makes it easier, but it does make it a little bit more complicated.
I find that, for my first book, it was different because, you write a dissertation that should turn into a book, and it was answering a personal question. So I guess that's the other part that I answered to Jennifer's question, which is, these books all feel personal to me. The first book was, why is the LA represented on television movies, not the LA that I know and that I grew up with? How is it this cultural story about race, and what were the mechanisms that made it different? And so I ended up telling that through public health, which affected zoning ordinances where people could, live and work, seek healthcare, etc. After that, I kind of went with, what am I interested in, and how can I then go back in time and understand that present moment in this way. And so for LA, I like writing about it because I'm still learning about LA. I'm still learning why it looks the way it does, why we interact the way we do, why people don't know the story of repatriation. As you know, I was really interested in the story of anchor baby. Where did that concept even come from? I assumed it was through Prop 187. And yet, as I went and did all this research, I could trace back to this concept of anchor babies back to 1930. And it's a story that I happened to tell through LA sources. That's where I found it, because so much of these stories that we think as national stories or immigration laws, they're understood at the local level, right? They're interpreted, or they kind of take place at the local level, and then the ideas are exported. And so as people were considering how to deal with birthright citizenship in the 1930s, LA, with the largest population of Mexicans since 1930s, came up to the plate and said, oh, we'll tell you how this would work in LA if you started to deport citizens. And really, they were talking about children. So I find it endlessly fascinating because although it's local, it tells this larger story about race.
Quick question. Somebody asked if Dr. Molina, you could name all of the books that you're currently writing and working on right now. I know you've mentioned a few, so people probably want to track.
Theme would be procrastination right now. So I'm working on a book called The Myth of Assimilation, and that'll be come out with Norton Press in their Norton Short series. They're already rolling some out, and I think the first one is by Taya Miles. I'm also working on a book on the Huntington Library on, the title is tentatively The Silent Hands That Built the Huntington. So I'm always interested in how we make race, why Latinos are hyper visible and simultaneously invisible. I think we have time for one more.
Well, I thought perhaps, since we do have a little bit of time and we don't have another audience question, perhaps each of you could just, I know, Jennifer, you have a book coming out if you want to briefly describe it, but also just one piece of advice for people who are interested in doing this kind of work or reading this kind of work. Just one quick piece of advice to everybody in the audience from each of you.
Well, I probably have the least advice, so I'll go first and then defer to those with a much greater track record in writing books. So I do have a book hopefully coming out at the end of this year, co-authored with Stephen Lee and Susan Coutine, with contributions from Samir Asher at UCI. Very excited, and it's called Legal Phantoms. And the book really focuses or takes as sort of the centerpiece, deferred action for parents. The program that never went into effect. The 2014 announcement from Obama was met with some Republican challenges, and ultimately it was enjoined and was never implemented. But the book really focuses on that phantom program and the impact that it had on the way that people mobilized, on the way that people planned and prepared for a program that never came into being. And I guess my advice would be just do it. I think you know, there are, I think, as Dr. Molina has stressed, so many untold stories, and so there's a need to sort of bring hands into the work and to get the writing on the page. And it can seem daunting, but I just feel like there's so much space for bringing these stories to light. So that's my naive advice. And now we can turn to the more seasoned book writers in the room.
I would say write what you're passionate about and do reading. And there's so much that has not been covered. I mean, I was shocked, truly shocked, when I didn't do a book on this. I wrote an article about this, but how little law has been used to look at the repatriation, and how little had really been written on the repatriation, even though it impacted generations of people in Los Angeles. And even I said a testimony at a hearing in Sacramento where one of the legislators said her father used to only go to the store with his passport in his top pocket because he was afraid of getting arrested and deported. So I think, write what you're passionate about.
I will go the other way then, since Dr. Chacón said, just do it. I'm at a stage where it's been difficult to just do it. Like, my writing has changed. It's a new project. So as much as you can, reach out and find community. And again, I kept mentioning this because he's here, Dr. Johnson, but just find someone and tell them what you're working on. We tend to think it has to be done, but our ideas evolve. My ideas have evolved in the course of this conversation. I've been inspired in the course of this conversation. So, find that community, reach out, find out what's holding you back from telling your story. Even when we have the time, sometimes we don't sit down and write. Why? Ask yourself, call a friend, tell them what you're passionate about, and let that passion drive you, not worrying about, whether something's going to get accepted, who's going to publish it, is someone going to like it. The more you share, the more the project moves along, but share with people you trust.
And one quick question, and then we're going to have to wrap up, but
oh yeah, somebody asked Dr. Molina if you were referring to the Huntington Library Art Museum for your upcoming.
Yes, it's over 100 years old now, and we've never known about all the people of color who worked to build that place.
Well, and on that note, I want to thank Professor Molina, Professor Chacón, Dean Johnson for joining us today to talk about A Place at the Nayarit. I also want to thank everyone in the audience who was part of this conversation. And we appreciate your being part of our last book talk for the series this semester. Thank you again.